That's why it's good Bud Meyer's not here, because I don't know where he got that picture of me, but I'm gonna. I have no idea. I'm probably on the way to the bathroom. But I'll kill him when I see him next. Advance. So, I'll leave it to you. You want to go through the votes, or you just want to have a chat? This is, by the way, we're very comfortable with it. We cause blizzards. Business Day, at least every 3 years, is in this kind of shape. Although this is the smallest, most intimate discussion we'll have. You all know this. That's the last election. I always like looking at those last totals. 105, 63 reelected to their current seat. 7 crossing over, and that's 6 going from the House to the Senate, only 1 trickling back. And that's the usual number. I think the most I've ever seen go from the Senate to the House is 3. But anyway, 33 people without legislative experience compared to 20 last time. Go. If you haven't looked at this, it's in our spiral-bound book. This is, and I don't know if it's in the report, business and professional people are half of this crowd. Ag and ranch is down 1. Ag business, about the same. And we had 1 person say wife, mother. Out of Aberdeen, and I can't think of how to pronounce her name.
Representative Brandy Schaaf-Bauer.
Thank you. Welcome. If you thought you were joining a meeting, you're Black Hills. I saw you getting out of the car. Don't sit next to him.
That's what Aaron says his job title is.
The company didn't pay $50 for you to be a lobbyist, or 40 or whatever. Go. Workforce housing got done. I think it was probably the first bill to get through the whole process. One of them.
If it wasn't 1011.
Yeah, no, it wasn't the first one signed. We'll talk about that one in a minute. $200 million going to the South Dakota Housing Development Authority. Has its own rules, created its own fund. Aberdeen was key, and EDPA was key in that. I don't know if you have any comments you want to offer.
Good to finally have it done.
This was a reprise from last year. Okay, next. Yep, go. Go. Yeah. It has value. All right, I was ready to talk about tax cuts. Yeah.
There's still one alive.
While everything else was snowed out, the legislature went to work on these. Now, at the risk, things can't get worse for me.
Just cover my badge here, make sure nobody can see who I represent.
We all know the House killed the governor's grocery tax. Ordinarily, and I know this is being recorded, and there's a reporter in the room, I would think that the governor's office has opportunities with titles laying around and arguments to be made. A skilled legislative team could make their argument and resurrect that. It's possible. I say this at risk. The governor's team has not shown that level of skill. So I don't my question to you in 30 seconds is going to be, do you agree? You all have been through this. I won't belabor anything, although I want to talk about it. The Senate was hostile to this at the start, so I'm not sure of the Senate leadership. is going to play any games with using a title to resurrect this. So let me go through a little analysis, and then let's talk about what did or didn't happen. 3 proposals, 2 of which are now dead, apparently dead. It's like Princess Bride. You know, there's dead, and there's, what's the term?
Mostly dead.
Thank you.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
Quote Princess Bride lines.
Yeah. Because by the end of this, you're going to be mostly dead.
Mostly dead.
Take groceries out, property tax reduction, reduce the overall rate. Reduce the overall rate's the only one that survived. So let's take a look at groceries. It's the broadest cut to my analysis. Solves issues of regressivity, although the governor was not making arguments about regressivity, but we debate this all the time. The Democrats are always reminding us that we don't have a refund program. We used to. In fact, the Chamber helped create it and defended it for 8 years. Then we got down to 217 families taking advantage, and it cost 10 times more to administer than, we got to the point where we were just sending you a check. So I had Wisegram ready to resurrect that program. He lasted until we went up to the Department of Social Services and talked to the crew that administered the last one. I almost didn't get him out of the building. He was so deflated. So that went away. But on the pro side of taking groceries out, it solves that issue. For the most part, it's a permanent tax break. And honestly, there's 3 states that tax food as broadly as we do. It wouldn't hurt to join the other 2. On the, the short side, reduces the tax base, revenue projections, may or may not be based on COVID dollars, makes the tax base smaller, less stable, and food will still be taxed. Everybody going to the grocery store thinking they're going to buy a whole bunch of prepared food, or not prepared food, a bunch of food to take home and have 0 tax, is going to be pissed because the local tax is there. And an argument that we've made quietly, you can't take the local tax away. Local governments use second penny sales tax to secure bonds. As soon as the bond holders hear that you're about to take the tax away, they're going to be calling that debt right and left. Then they're going to have to see Everson and Dykhouse. Fair analysis?
Fair analysis. So, and the hearing yesterday, day before yesterday, was fascinating. I mean, I think, I don't want to speak out of turn. Some of the people in the crowd here today have been doing this a lot longer than I have, but probably in the last 20 to 30 years, you can count on one hand the number of times a sitting governor has come and testified personally before a legislative committee. So the outcome of the bill, I think, was surprising to some, maybe not surprising to others, but it was definitely historic regardless. I think it's a great analysis, and it will continue to be a discussion going forward, especially with one of the other bills that David will talk about in a minute here.
Commissioner, welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm late.
I don't think you need to introduce yourself, but there's a reporter in the room. You want to confess? Your name, your office?
Steve Wester, Commissioner of the Governor's Office of Economic Development.
If the question in your mind is, have they canceled business day? The answer is they should have. But, so we're not formally voting on any of this, but we are having an informal discussion.
And if you came because Ryan Budmeyer was supposed to be co-hosting, he got turned around by Highway Patrol.
That was the only reason I came.
So I lower the average IQ up here, but I make David look good.
I can't add to that. A drowning man will grab about anything he sees that floats, and I grab Smith. Comments on sales tax, even though it's kind of dead. I will tell you, and I'm in the middle of writing this analysis, and I can't figure out why I can't finish it. I will tell you, if you evaluate these 3 things on 2 criteria, as a tax break and as tax policy, in my analysis, this is the strongest tax break that's been offered. It hits all citizens in the grocery store, solves that regressivity problem, is a robust dollar amount, and then it's a chase on whether you get the dollars back. That's different than tax policy. I'll make that point in a minute. Next. Oh, we got to go past. We've decided that even though, Steve, even though we wouldn't record the votes, everybody knows, everybody in this room, and at dinner tonight when we showed the slides, everybody would be going, that was the secretary. Second idea is this idea of property tax break, which started out from a summer study of $100,000 reduction in taxable value for all homes, only for school general funds. I'm somewhat proud that the Chamber was a voice that started early saying, that won't work. And I think they figured it out because they turned it into a just flat $300 stipend for every property, home, owner-occupied property. So, easier to administer, everyone gets the benefit, and property taxes are something that they're hearing a lot about, being too high. I used to take 9 properties in Sioux Falls and go back to the Janklo's return, when they started this state aid formula to give owner-occupied and agriculture the tax break that we now have. The house I live in, tried to sell, so I'm living in a house I can prove nobody else wants. Taxes, when that break started, were $6,000. They went down as far as high 4,000s. They didn't cross the 6,000 level for a decade. So, but most people have bought their house since then. They don't know the property taxes, so they hear a lot about that. Cons, homeowners only, not renters. As much as taking groceries out creates a hole of 100 million, this creates an obligation of 80 million that you're going to have to do. It becomes an entitlement. It's going to be like the state aid formula. You're going to start with whatever percent and then have to add 80 million, and it's going to grow. We're going to build more single-family, owner-occupied homes than we're going to tear down. I mean, we tear them down. I used to go to towns of about 300 population, 400. And I drove around, I'll never admit which one, and I stopped into one of the local stores. And I said, I don't see a lot of empty homes. And honestly, she kind of looked at the floor and said, we have a way of taking care of that. So I went back out and drove around. Now I'm seeing homes on really big lots with 2 curb cuts. They take them down. But they're not taking them down faster than we're building them, so that goes up. And you got a timing with property taxes. We pay property taxes in arrears. So this will be a credit in 2024. That's not bad in this election year. They're politicians. But if you escrow your payment, so the bank sees they wrote a smaller check. So you get the difference in 2025. And if your insurance has gone up, you don't know. You're never going to know. So, pro and con on property, and speak what you know.
Nope, I was just going to ask you to talk to exactly that. The fact that I would assume most people in South Dakota who have an owner-occupied property have a mortgage of some amount on it. Probably wouldn't, unless they read their statements in detail, they're not going to probably realize that they got the $300 credit. So it's difficult to show that this was a great thing for those South Dakotans.
Questions?
Not renters, but are you saying the people in there or people who own that?
Both. But I was focused on people that rent homes and rent apartments don't get the tax break. They shouldn't. But if you're evaluating this as a tax break, as opposed to who gets a smaller bill in a grocery store, this doesn't benefit as many people as others.
So if I'm renting the property, I mean, I'm the owner of the property and I'm renting it, I don't get the break.
No,
Still, I don't
Correct.
owner occupied, because you're paying as a commercial rate. So for state aid, what?
Multifamily falls under commercial.
Right.
Yep.
And you don't occupy, what if you own a home you rent out and it's a single, you're not occupying it, so that's commercial rate still. Technically other, because we're not too creative around here.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Questions, comments? How many renters in a room? Okay, go. And last, reduce the overall rate. The bill that passed takes it from 4.5 to 4.2. And I don't know the precise physical price tag on that, was slightly over 100?
Yes, 107 million.
Okay, he introduced it at 4, which was 180 plus.
Yep.
That-
200
That
plus.
overshot the mark. So, this reduces the tax on everybody, including us. When the business community buys software, buys office supplies, we pay the tax. And so we're not going to pay 4.5, we're going to get to pay 4.2 or 3 if you see the example. So that's a plus. Even candy eaters get when you define food, you have a difference between grocery food and things like candy. Everybody talks about the Twix bar. It's got a little wafer in there. Some states, that's food. It's got chocolate all over it. The rest of the states, that's candy. I just know they taste good. You're not narrowing the tax base. You're not taking food out of it. On the con side, I offer 2. Nobody's going to know. You're going to go from 4.5 to 4.2. Big whoop.
We attorneys will use it as a major selling point that, hey, your legal services are going to cost less now. Come talk to us.
And he's going to take credit for it with his clients. And it's the same arguments as taking food out, except you haven't narrowed the base. You've committed to less revenue. And so if future years are a problem, then you got a problem. Now, this takes the same 2/3 vote we did to put the halfpenny in, and we can finally stop all the confusion about the Partridge Amendment, which was tacked on when we added the 5% to get the last 4 or 5 votes. Nobody knew what it meant then. Nobody knew how it was going to work. We've never figured out how it was going to work, so we've just ignored it. And so we can get the crowd that keeps complaining about that to shut up, and we can take away that issue by saying, we did it.
And additionally, nobody remembers who Partridge was anyway, so. I wish he was here to hear it.
He's twice as tall as you. Comments, questions? This is the one that lives. I don't know if they can resurrect any of the other, and as I said, I will tell you, I've never been a fan, this is, I think, the better tax policy. The governor's plan was the broader, better tax break, if you're only evaluating tax breaks. I think it was, as you all know, nobody expected the House to do that. I thought this was supposed to happen in the Senate. So
Well,
it happened
on the
so,
Senate, this came out of the House overwhelmingly, 66 votes in favor of it.
Yep.
And now it goes over to the Senate. We all know the Senate is a different animal, but We don't know yet at this point, at least the rank and file folks don't know, what the Senate is going to do with this proposal. But now that the property tax piece is gone, there are still at least 4 vehicles on tax that could be used to host anything or everything that somebody might come up with. But the 3 this session that have been talked about the most are cutting all sales tax, cutting the sales tax on groceries, and cutting property taxes. 2 of those, for now, are dead legislatively. This is the one that's alive, and we'll see what the Senate does with it.
What Senate committee will this go to? I'm going to look that up.
Well, that depends on Lee Schoenbeck, who I think will send it to State Affairs so they have better control. He might send it to his tax committee. But what?
Hasn't been assigned yet.
Yeah, I don't think it has. He'll send it to wherever he thinks he gets the result he wants.
If you have some input and you want to text him, he might.
And he has been openly hostile to the governor's proposal since she made the proposal. So, yeah. Other questions, comments? We move on. Oh, yeah, you gotta skip all of this. I was gonna have everybody vote on pro-con, so we got a sense of where the crowd was on all 3 pro-con. We won't do that. Keep going. Family leave policy. Governor, current state employee leave policy is 6 weeks at 60% pay. Do I have the weeks right on that? It's 6? I've been
Thought
wondering.
it was 8 weeks at
Yeah, it could be
80%,
8.
right? Okay,
60%,
thank
yeah.
you. 8 weeks, 60%.
She wants to go to 12 weeks at 100%. She can do that on her own. That's a budget issue. That's part of compensation. But she's been trying and has shared a vision that says, can we help the private sector adopt a similar policy by maybe making it less expensive by creating an insurance plan that we could offer to the private sector. Our board hasn't endorsed this part of it if for no other reason that it's kind of out of the box and creative and it's an important issue. She had a second bill that we have stayed away from there. She would seed the creation of that insurance policy with $5 million a year for 4 years, $20 million to help stabilize the premium at a lower rate, to avoid waiting to go through that growth curve. Both of those are dead, I think.
And so I'll just, if you're okay,
Yeah.
I'll just talk a little more
Yeah.
about some of the background here. So this was based on a lot of work. We know from different groups in the state, we know from talking to the governor's office and her staff that there was a lot of research and advanced work that went into putting these 2 proposals together. It was based on a couple of models that have been passed in some other states, most notably New Hampshire, where they enacted the same type of thing. The state would purchase through an RFP process. They'd have a life insurer come in that's writing a family leave product, and then they would use that to expand the benefits to the state employees. In this case, according to the governor's office, it would have the policy would have cost about $3 million per year. That product would have been a group type product, and they would have allowed private businesses across the state to buy into it. And then Senate Bill 154, the companion bill, would have given, like David said, $20 million to pay down some of the rebates, to give premium rebates to those employers for the first 4 years to help incentivize them to join the group plan, which ends up at the end of the day lowering the overall cost of the plan because you have a broader base funding it. New Hampshire has had, they just passed theirs within the last couple of years, maybe 1 or 2 years ago. They haven't had a whole lot of buy-in initially just because it's a brand new thing and people are still looking at it. So, we do know that there's precedent for this. It was unsuccessful. 154 was actually defeated first by the Senate Health Committee on a vote of 4-2, and then the House Appropriations Committee killed 1151, which is the programmatic bill, unanimously, which I think both bills, for those of us who were sitting in the room, that was a huge shock. Evidently, the governor's staff was let in advance that was probably going to happen, but for those of us who were in the room on them, that was very surprising.
Why did it happen? Why did it happen?
I think for sure 154, from the comments that were made by the members of the committee, there were concerns with a couple of things. One, why only have it be 4 years? Because there's going to be employers, if they adopt into it, are going to want incentives for longer than that. There were, another one of the senators said, well, we worry that if we're incentivizing this product from this one particular insurer, it's going to disincentivize people to buy other products offered by private insurers, so it's, kind of creates an unlevel playing field. And then they wanted to know why $20 million was the specific amount. And, yeah, so those were the comments from the committee members. The House Appropriations Committee, I can't remember what a lot of the comments were, but again, you'd have to talk to the legislators about that.
And I just don't think some of that crowd, 105, are ready to do something innovative and makes it look like, when she first announced this, way before the session, panic went through the business community like a lightning bolt. What do you mean she's going to mandate family leave? So I think people are nervous that this morphs into something more. Others, questions?
If you guys have any conversations, it's going to come back. Because this is like, we look at this completely different in our economic development. This is a workforce issue.
Right.
And significant enhancement. I think what happened here is this is so foreign to many individuals that if we worked, not only we is, but if we worked on this over the next 9 months and provided proper education or better education, not that the education is good, but there needs to be further education on why this is not a bad thing. It would actually, I know we're usually, South Dakota is not known for being first. We're usually toward the latter end, but this would actually,
Or not at all?
yeah, not at all.
Okay.
This would actually significantly enhance and be a really good thing for employers, especially for those who can't afford it on their own.
The first hearing on House Bill 1151 took place in House State Affairs, if I remember right. During that hearing, there were a lot of groups who testified in favor of the bill. And I don't remember anyone testifying in opposition to 1151. Sioux Falls Chamber and others made those exact remarks. We got up there and we said, this is a good bill. This is going to help us build workforce. It deals with an issue of that a lot of our employees have. We want to be able to provide these benefits. This is a way we can get it and have incentives for the first couple of years to help us get our start. In the second hearing, and then that committee referred it unanimously to House Appropriations. In the hearing before House Appropriations, there was the governor's office and one other organization that testified in favor, and then there was pretty much, that was it. That was silence after that. And then that's when it was, maybe because everybody else knew the fix was in. I testified in favor for 2 organizations, but again, it was, yeah. So I do think this conversation will continue, and I think several of the legislators on both those committees said, we hope that the governor will work with the business community, work with others over the next year, and bring it back. So,
Your focus as a workforce issue is shared with the economic development professionals in the Chamber of Commerce world. And so this is the time to talk to the commissioner, who's already on the team because he works for the governor, but get people from his office, the governor's office, to the weekly, monthly chicken circuit, put it in the newsletter, talk to the legislators and say, look, this is weird. And key to that is watching New Hampshire and seeing if this is a viable way to do it. I had a lot of, I had 4 members which when you're, working in a small room in Sioux Falls is a lot. Chafe at the fact that they had to pay the premium for all their employees to know that one or two would take advantage of it. To which I responded, isn't that how insurance works? So I think we've got to have time for people to get used to it. The crowd has grown significantly with Deborah Owen, the aforementioned, and our son Gentry. So he's a great student, National Merit Scholar, and a hell of a good drummer.
I'll just add to what David said. To the governor's office's credit, a couple of my lobbying clients and I were involved in discussions with the governor's staff about these measures before the session ever began. So they did a lot of that homework. And I'm not throwing that out there to dig on anybody, least of all the legislators who voted against the bills, from whom I still need votes this session. But I will say, to their credit, the governor's office did make that attempt to work with stakeholders on this issue.
Let's go forward. House Bill 1011, reemployment assistance. I'm so glad the secretary's here, because I'm one of the ones that's a knuckle dragger. I keep calling it unemployment insurance because that's what I'm used to, and I'm old. This sailed through. This is the coolest news ever. We've got a ton of money in that trust fund. Unemployment or reemployment assistance, every business pays in on the first $15,000 of pay for every job, which means that folks that have entry-level pay, like fast food, like retail operations, like tourist operations, pay that percent on most of their payroll, as opposed to bankers, manufacturers, and others that pay 60, 70,000. They're only paying it on the first 15. But the rates, whoa.
Yep.
Thank God we don't have a lot of people in here. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide. Stop.
It's David. It's not. It's David. It's all David.
No, I turned the page when I shouldn't have. Thank God there's not a lot of people.
If only Ryan Budmeyer were here to save us.
So I've been texting him.
It's his fault.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, he did the slides, by the way. Did a hell of a good job. Senate Bill 120 is making its way through the session. Economic development groups like in Aberdeen, when they hold property, the first $750,000 is tax exempt. We're trying to move that up slightly. The bill drafted was $10 million. That seemed a little excessive to some people, like everybody on the committee. So it got rolled back to $5 million. The important part of this is, do I have the numbers? No. It's a tax shift. Nobody loses money. Cities get their money. Counties get their money. School districts get their money because local effort goes down, state aid goes up. Capital outlay and bond issues are set by dollar amount. They will get those dollars. It's not costing anybody money. It is a tax shift, a microscopically small tax shift. The soundbite tax shift is way worse than happens. I did Lincoln County because they've got like $8 billion worth of taxable value. And for the county levy, you're shifting $9,000 onto $9 billion taxable value. I don't know how far to the right of the decimal point that is, but that's what we're talking about. And then Howdy Shell, who I used to like, starts walking around talking about, he just openly says, Owen picked Lincoln because it's the third richest county. That's not true. I picked Lincoln because it was the first county I could get the budget levies on. But I did Kingsbury County. Scale's the same, $1.6 billion. And the cost to the county on a similar levy is about $9,000. That's still a fairly small tax shift. We'll see how this does. It's up tomorrow morning. Since I popped off of the numbers, I'll be back up there running my mouth again. Any questions on this? Right in front of, okay. Now we go to, we'll get you out of here fairly quickly. Yeah, okay. 9,000 on 16 million, Kingsbury County, 8,000 on 1.6. That should, yeah, $1 million budget. It's the same. It's a tax shift.
Sorry.
Shift matters, or shift happens.
It's a tough shift.
Yeah,
happens.
that's, okay. All right. Now we're on unemployment insurance. I can walk over here. Next year I'll order a pointer. You remember that when we were all using pointers? 1011 on unemployment insurance creates a rate chart that's lower than our current one. Here's the maximum rate currently is 9.3%. On 15,000 is almost 1,400. Maximum rate will be 8.8%. You see the difference and the base. Here's the really cool thing. It used to be when we had surcharges. If the account goes dry, we kick in a surcharge. So you pay your fee and then the surcharge. We did this in 2009. It was icky. But I kept asking, the surcharge didn't get credited to your account. And I kept bugging the two secretaries, and sadly I'll report Don Kaki used to run this. He has passed away about 2 weeks ago. His funeral was Saturday. He used to, why can't that happen? Well, they figured out how to make it happen. So if we have another surcharge, I'll be retired. But the payments that you make for that surcharge will now go to your account. It's a huge accomplishment. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Will your retirement count as unemployment?
I'll be filing.
I'm very glad that David did not throw any of this discussion to me, because the first week of the legislative session, I told Deborah Owen, I'm going to have to sit down and have David explain to me what this bill means, because I read it 3 times and I have no idea.
All right. Yes. Oh, no.
We didn't do an emergency clause.
You didn't? You didn't need it? I thought it had it. Okay. It was the first bill signed by the governor.
It wasn't the first bill. I think the most amazing thing about it is that we have 30,000-ish tax-paying entities in the state, and we're going to go to almost 15,000 of them that have a zero tax rate after this.
I didn't think you wanted people to know that.
So, just to confirm, for those on YouTube, not having an emergency clause means House Bill 1011 will not go into effect until July 1.
This year.
So it will not impact tax rates already set for 2023.
Right.
The first reduction employers will see is in their tax rates for 2024.
Thank you.
I say that for when I make my children sit down and watch this video on YouTube.
That'll get your kids taken away from you. All right. Okay, let's go. We got to. This idea of hostile governments is in 2 different bills. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Again, I think we got to give the governor credit for bringing the topic up. I don't know if the solutions he's offering, one of them's dead. Are they both dead?
No. 189 is now over in the House.
Okay. You know, how do you identify? I ran into this statistic on the Google machine during the State of the State address. South Dakota has 49 million acres total. 47 are ag million. 356,000 are foreign owned by somebody. And that includes like Canada, Mexico, Minnesota, or Wyoming? I don't know. You don't want, she brought in an expert that talked about the Chinese threat. Nobody could sit through that comfortably. And so I think she has started a dialogue. I think we're searching for the right answer. The majority leader in the House has a vision that says, oh, let's track foreign ownership before we start doing things. The vision that takes 180 days to review seems like too much. We're curious about having to list foreign owners for publicly traded companies, and they weren't going to do contracts. I asked about Smithfield because we all know or suspect Smithfield's ownership is Chinese. And the governor's office said Smithfield does not contract directly with governments. A-Mark, whatever that thing is, that has catering contracts in a lot of public places, buys from Smithfield, that would still be legal. So we'll keep an eye on this.
So for those following 189, it is actually currently in effect. Governor Noem signed Executive Order 2023-02 back at the first half of January, which does essentially the same thing. The state is not permitted to, the state, so 189 is all government subdivisions. The executive order says the state is not allowed to contract with any entity that is owned by a company or the government for one of those hostile countries. That's currently in effect, and if you are a state contractor, currently you're required to sign a written certification saying you don't have any such ownership. That's already in effect. I've talked to clients who have already signed those and sent them back to the state. Very quick, easy process. 189 was heavily amended based on a lot of the comments from some of the people who had concerns about the bill. 185, which would have created the central committee to review all ag land purchases, was defeated on the Senate floor, I believe, this week.
Thank you. Questions?
Is there a definition or list of hostile governments who maintains that?
I think you had that on one of the slides here.
Yes. There is a list on the one for foreign ownership, and there's 6 of them.
It's on the next slide. Oh, no, it was the last one. I'm sorry. Yep.
Is that something that's defined in the bill, or is that
Yes.
contingent on something?
They were listed,
Defined in the bill.
specifically listed.
By the way, depending on where you stand on a number of bills this year, I understand the legislature counts as a hostile government, so. Sorry.
So you're done for the year. All right, let's go. Comments on hostile governments? I'm going to throw Dana an unfair question, but do you have separate, banks are kind of regulated, like somewhat. Does foreign governments come into play on your ownership or regulations?
And I'll be honest, I've been at this 4 years with South Dakota and never had that issue.
Okay, all right, thank you. Let's do one more on Medicaid expansion.
I think on that one, it's just managing unintended consequences is the thing, but the purpose or the reason for the bill, I think, is very, very good.
Yeah. No, I brought a Y2K liability bill, and Janklow brought me in for the treatment that you've all had, and I was thrilled to get, because he said, this is the stupidest bill I've ever read, to which I first thought, wow, he really does that. And second, I thought, I'm in. I've now been baptized. My comment is the same. We went back and forth, and I finally said, look, all I know is this. If everything goes held on January 1st, we're going to be in this building wishing we'd done something. So we might as well do this. To which, honestly, he goes, I got to talk to Gregerson, who was with me. He goes, you're done. So I left. Anyway, I think you're right. We got to find the right way to respond, but we can't ignore it. Voters expanded Medicaid, and so that will have budget implications, but there's a bonus. We get 5% added to our regular Medicaid. So we've been advocating, take those savings, put them off to the side, because when those incentives are done, we're going to face a budget issue that could be as skinny as 13 million and could be as robust as 40 or 50. Terwilliger has put in the FY25 budget 77 million, which we think is nuts, but he's being cautious. So we have a Bill 149 that's saying take those savings and just earmark them to use. What they plan on doing right now is kind of our worst fear, and DFC, Avera, and Sadaho are leading this issue. We supported this concept last year, so we're kind of standing in the back of the crowd yelling, hit him, and trying to keep this fight alive. Because right now they're doing our worst fear. They've lowered the amount of money they think they have to invest in Medicaid. They've reduced the DSS budget, and they're going to spend it. And so it's like 50 to 60 million a year for 2 years, and then it kind of drips away. So a lot of legislators kind of looking at us. I had to testify in front of Bolin. He came to our board, so I just admitted it. He came, said we shouldn't do this. We ignored every word he said, and we endorsed it. So we're sensitive to the budget issues, but we still think it's a workforce issue, and we endorsed it. You want to add anything? The 2 in the middle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an idea that was heard last year with Queenstein Tower, so it's not a totally new concept. It's just setting money aside, like you said, to use for one-time money that can be applied prospectively for this.
Passed the Senate yesterday,
Yeah.
so you got it. Talk about
We're going to deal with tomorrow. We'll let you do that. You want to do the intro?
No.
Yeah, so the other point up here is around going back to the voters for them to consider whether they should allow the state to proceed with a work requirement for people that would be covered through the expansion. The thing that's ironic, I guess you might say, about this is that in the current constitutional amendment that voters just passed, it was really clear that there would not be any requirements placed upon the expansion population outside of what is required for Medicaid today. So voters clearly said, we want this to run the same way as the current program does as it pertains to, what people have to go through. So this would change that. There's, the issue of work requirements on state Medicaid expansion programs. There's some history there. There's not currently one state that's approved to do this, but at the federal level. There were 13 states in the last administration that were allowed to move forward. That's all been taken back by CMS or court orders. And so getting the approval needed to do this and still draw down to 90% federal funding is, you can't count on that.
Right.
I think that measure was proposed by a brand-new legislator this year.
Yeah.
Representative Tony Van Huysen?
Name sounds familiar. You want to tell them what? Yeah,
He's on
everybody.
the record for not being a great Medicaid expansion supporter, so
True.
Fair enough.
he's on the record.
Well,
So I
And-
would just add one thing to this, that what he proposed is taking the constitutional amendment that passed the voters and adding one sentence and putting that back on the ballot in 2024.
Right.
So we would have another ballot measure on Medicaid expansion, the same language except adding the work requirements. People, it's going to be a huge education issue. We are hearing this bill tomorrow, and hopefully we have
So there's an amendment proposed that would say the federal government must approve if we're going to do this, but hopefully we can defeat it, so then nobody's no doubt.
Is that still in the House? The Senate, that's right. Pass the House. That's right.
I take great offense at this issue. Well, these able-bodied people, you know, that's why we have to have this, because all these able-bodied people are working. I don't know how much more statistics and information you can give them about the fact that able-bodied people generally are working. Sometimes they're not because they're in issues where they're not having health issues, or even children who have them, that somebody has to take care of. Transportation. It's just, to me, it's just kind of slapping things.
I got another issue with Tony in that unless we've gone to the legislature and asked things be put on the ballot. You're on record. You can't get away from this. My issue is it is unwise for the legislature to put things on the ballot unless they got a group standing there saying, we'll do the campaign. Because they've put countless stuff on the ballot, and then they can't campaign on it. They can't use taxpayer money for that. And, you know, they're busy raising their own money. They're not going to raise money for anything. I don't know if work requirements will be compelling enough that in this conservative state people will just vote for it, but I've told him, don't put it on the ballot unless you have somebody who's going to raise money and run that campaign, and sure as hell it ain't going to be us. And so I did endorse it the first time. I won't be there tomorrow because I'm busy.
I'm also wondering whether he's thinking that we have to go to all districts to put any initiative on there. I'm just wondering if the legislature is going to actually do that too.
Yeah.
That's House Bill 1200.
I know they have to.
So it passed the House, and it's now going to be over in the Senate. I think it's been assigned to Senate State Affairs, and it's not been heard over there yet. But so for those in the audience, this measure would say if you're going to be, when you gather signatures to put an amendment or a statute on the ballot for consideration, you have to gather a certain number of signatures from every county in the state so that it's representative of the entire state.
Every legislative district.
Thank you. Sorry. Every legislative district, so that it's representative, according to the proponents, of all the populous voters, whatever, of South Dakota, rather than you just sending people to Rapid and Sioux Falls to gather all the necessary signatures.
I also was in the chambers listening to that yesterday, and, I mean, just think of this, okay, so you go to a certain district and you want to get the required number, but if you don't, that means that district has just stopped you from putting something on the ballot.
Right.
That's what we do.
It's just a naked attempt to make putting initiatives, there's a group in the legislature, and there's a lot of them, that just hate the initiative and referendum process. And I always hand out the charts that say, excuse me, more people vote for initiatives and ballot measures than vote for the constitutional offices. People like them. Be careful. Be cautious. My board doesn't like them. But they're a part of the process. Voters do like them. But, yeah, I know. Okay, my board, with the exception of at least one or two, doesn't like them, and they're just a reality. There's a lot of people that think that was the first mistake South Dakota made, but they're there, and we've asked twice for amendments. So sometimes, we use them. So anyway. Any other questions, issues? It's about 2:30, don't look at that, it's about 2:33. We have Neil Bradley coming on at 3. Is it a family issue or something for the general cause? Yes?
I was really good at catch back with Medicaid expansion, because we have, the Chamber has struggled with this amendment bill on change the public's adoption of Medicaid expansion. But I think sometimes folks get, there's so much in this room, but it's important to remember those who should be eligible for it aren't getting enriched, although they're getting health care.
What do I do here?
So not everybody's going to use it. Well, some people
Well, we got into it out of workforce issues, and able-bodied, you're going back to, I've personally witnessed my wife go through cancer.
Thank you.
So she kept going to work, but a lot of people can't. And so they can't work for 6 months, so they're out of the workforce. If they don't have access to medical care, they're dead. If we can get them medical care, yes, it costs money, but we get them back as productive citizens. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I love the theory that says you're going to impoverish yourself just to get health insurance. If you're that sick, you're not working anyway. Anyway, you want to get in on this?
No, they just gave me fresh batteries, but I have nothing to add to that discussion. No, yes, they were Energizer batteries.
Questions? I'll turn you loose.
Can I ask a question about something you didn't talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. As long as we're allowed to say beats the snot out of us.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I'm just more curious for the, I think there's a small group in here, but a well-educated group. I would like something to, I'd like to hear people's opinions on this. Forgive me, I don't know the bill number, but the bill that's moving through that would make it so all state offices have to go through a primary.
Ooh.
The conventions can't pick this anymore. You know, what, I just opened it up.
No, let me tell you why Justin's going to answer this first. He is an officer with the Republican Party. He has served as parliamentarian. He's been to more Lincoln Day dinners than is healthy for his brain and his heart. But he can give you an inside the convention kind of perspective on this. Boom.
The bill you're talking about is Senate Bill 40. It would, actually read through it today in detail. Some things that aren't talked about with the bill, it actually says not just that we're going to take Attorney General, Secretary of State, Treasurer, Auditor, and Lieutenant Governor out of the conventions and make them traditional primaries. It also says state parties must hold a convention every 4 years, whereas now it's every even-numbered year. This would say every year you have a presidential election. That was a surprise to me and something that's not talked about that often. The proponents of the bill, who, for what, it is what it is, they're Republicans. They look at the convention that happened in June of 2022, last year in Watertown, and they have, I would say, a lot of heartburn with how that process worked, and they would like it to be more representative of the primaries, to be more representative of how elections traditionally run, and they want South Dakotans generally, the Republican Party generally, to be able to participate fully in the primaries rather than having to go through the work of registering as a delegate, traveling to Watertown or Rapid or Sioux Falls or wherever they're having it every 2 years. And at the primary, at the convention, where you typically only have at most about 500 people voting, they'd like it to be for the entire state. The opponents argue, look, primaries are expensive. It's going to cost a whole bunch of extra money if you want to run for auditor or secretary of state or any of these other offices to fund both the primary campaign and a general election campaign. They believe that the party and the platform and everything else should be part and parcel of that. It draws more people to the convention and gets more participation in the rank and file running of the party generally. I don't know where it's going to go, but boy, it came hard out of the Senate. So now it's waiting over in the House.
Any other comments? Anybody specifically want to lower your head so the camera doesn't see you as part of this conversation?
Any sense of how many other states have
Oh, Lord.
What
Really?
he said.
What are they? What states are they? You don't. Okay.
Don't quote me on that.
Well, if there's any
Guadalajara.
the public health world, you never want to be like Mississippi and Alabama. I'm just saying.
Careful, I was born in Georgia, so. My dad was born in Alabama.
Now we know.
I do think that a decent number of states, I don't know if it's a majority, but a lot of states have the governor picking who's the Attorney General, who's the Secretary of State, et cetera. I think there's a decent number, like they have at the federal level, that's kind of the way they pick their constitutional offices. I don't know how many have them elected by primaries, but we are definitely in a distinct minority of states that have their primaries done at conventions the way we do here. Oh.
I was shocked. I spent 17 years in Montana, and they do primaries, and I come back here. What the hell? That's okay.
David, I'm wondering if you're done with this conversation.
Yeah.
There has been so many appropriations bills. I don't know if other people are feeling it like I have spent more time in appropriations this year than ever. Any comments about just the whole general appropriations process and the work that they're all doing? And, I mean, they have had intense days and nights of bill after bill after bill. It's just, and I just commented for these folks, is that it's just been such a, I'll say, interesting process to watch and see the work that group has been involved in. I think totally different than other years.
I usually need a passport to go into the appropriations room. In fact, I told the committee this, the Senate committee. I represent the people that pay it in. I don't watch how it goes out very often. I should. As a non-participant, he watches it more, and Deborah actually watches it closer. This business of using separate appropriations committees seemed to have started like 2 years ago, and it was done with a lot of acrimony, especially in the House. The change of leadership in the House, in my experience, has made it less contentious. And so I'm less aware of how that individual work is done, but I am aware of the fact that we each now have our appropriations committee, and we're pre-screening some stuff before it gets to joint. And I don't know if it's as acrimonious as it has been in the last 2 years. It seems less so.
There's more money to be had, so there's more ideas being debated.
Okay.
My comment would be to build on what David said. The fact that the appropriations committees this year are doing so much more work and so much more in-depth work is clearly by design. This was all something that was set up and dreamed up by the new leadership this year before the session ever began. It seems like this was definitely a plan. And so the fact that the appropriations committees on both sides and the joint are doing so much more work, I think they're all in for it. I've seen in my 13 years of lobbying a record number of bills that don't even include a specific dollar amount appropriation, that because they are spenders, they're just being sent one by one over to appropriations, where they will either live or they will be killed. So again, I think the work is by design. It's definitely less acrimonious, and it seems to be flowing pretty quickly, even though it is more work.
And that there is a lot of money that they
Yeah.
work with and look at and make decisions about.
Yeah, but we did all that federal money through that system. I mean, we've had 3 years of just cash rolling around the place. Sorry if that sounded argumentative. Mary Ann's been giving me a signal. Yeah, well, I thought Mary Ann was telling me to steal third. Turns out we have our next presentation. So as punishment to people that are waiting till 3 o'clock, we're going to hear Neil Bradley from the U.S. Chamber, who will be introduced by a former chair of ours, Steve Kirby. And you will be able to ask questions, I assume, with this. So I'll hang out and be ready for that. Thank you, Justin, for filling in with me.
Happy to do it. Thank you.
Introducing
Good
Steve
afternoon,
Kirby.
everyone. Wish I was there, but very interesting comments so far. I'm introducing Neil in part because I'm on the board of directors of the U.S. Chamber for the past many years. Neil is the executive VP, chief policy officer, and head of strategic advocacy. Neil is really the person who is responsible for the Chamber's overall advocacy efforts. And fortunately, our board and the officers learned a long time ago, the chamber doesn't do anything without Neil's rubber stamp, without his leadership. And it is a daunting task that he has. We see how tough David Owen's job can be. Well, this is all 50 states, and he just does a marvelous job of providing the leadership at every turn. He's very nice of you, Neil, to join our legislative day at here in South Dakota. And the floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Well, Steve, thank you, and thanks for your leadership on our board, and a special shout out to my friends at the South Dakota Chamber. Thanks for the relationship that we have with you all. We are smarter and stronger because of the relationship and understanding what's going on in South Dakota and with other chambers kind of across the country, and being able to collectively influence the direction of national policy. So it's been a few years since I was with you the last time. A lot has changed since then. And so it's great to be back today. And I think what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking about where we are in the economy, because I think that drives a lot of what we should be thinking about in terms of advocacy. Second, talking about some of the opportunities that we see from an advocacy standpoint to really make a difference in the public policy environment that supports free enterprise and a growing economy. And then third, just take your questions and talk about whatever it is that you want to talk about. Let me start with the economy. About a quarter to halfway through last year, we had a deep dive here at the U.S. Chamber trying to figure out what was going on in the economy and the split screen that we were seeing between what people were saying they felt about the economy and what was actually happening in terms of how they operated their business, their personal finances, and how they were describing their own personal situation. And we coined the term secondhand pessimism to describe what we see as the current state of affairs. Secondhand pessimism, in short, is I'm pessimistic about the overall state of affairs, and in this case, the direction of the economy. And I'm pessimistic not because of my own personal experience and my own business experience, but because of what I think is going on everywhere else. And let me give you an illustration of that that's straight out of the quarterly survey that we do here at the U.S. Chamber of small businesses all across the United States. And this is from the end of last year, Q4, but it's representative of what we had seen really for the prior 2 quarters. We asked small business owners, what do you think about the health of the U.S. economy? And 17% said, oh, the U.S. economy, it's in very poor condition. 37% said it was somewhat poor. Only 11%, 1 in 10, said the economy was very good. And that's the same thing that you see when you survey consumers nationwide, like the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment does. It's the same thing you actually see when you survey larger businesses, that kind of pessimism about the direction of the economy. Then we asked them, okay, well, you're a small business owner. Tell us about your business. What's the state of your business? And nearly 3 times as many said that their business was very good. So 31% said, my business is in great shape. It is going very good. But the national economy, only 11% said as much. 33% said it was somewhat good. Of small business owners, only 1% said that their business was in very poor condition. And compare that to the 17% who said the same thing about the nation. That sentiment, that disconnect between individuals' views of the overall economy and their personal experience in their own business has held true for consumers. We see rising retail sales in January, for example, while at the same time, consumer sentiment and outlook is falling. We see the same thing when we do a similar survey of the mid-market. Not companies that aren't exactly small, more than 500 employees, but aren't Fortune 500. They report the same thing. And when we interview CFOs of Fortune 500 companies, very similar. the real question is why is that the case? And is the reflections of their personal experiences more accurate than their opinions about the overall economy? And it's our conclusion that their reflections on the state of their business are actually more reflective about the state of the economy than their reflections on the overall economy. And you see this in a lot of other statistics. We can take employment, for example. You know, we're plumbing the depths of low levels of unemployment. We haven't had a level of unemployment nationwide this low since the early 1950s, back when we actually didn't have very good records. In South Dakota, I think you all know, you're 2.3% unemployment. You're tied for the second lowest in the nation. Since we've been keeping track by states, South Dakota has never had an unemployment rate as low as it is today. So on the job front, there are plenty of jobs. The problem, as we'll discuss in a minute, is the fact that we actually can't fill the open jobs that we have. But there are other ways to measure the state of the economy. And one of them is the willingness of individuals to take risk and start a new business. So you all know it's a daunting endeavor to start a new business. Generally, if you have a negative outlook about the economic climate, it is not a time when you go out and put your own personal credit at risk to open a new business. Yet we are seeing record number of new business starts across the country. Last year in South Dakota, 10,422 new business licenses were filed for people opening up new businesses. By comparison, that's a 35% increase compared to 2019. So back when people thought the economy was going really well, they were actually taking fewer risks and starting fewer businesses than they are today. So what might explain some of this disconnect? I think there are really probably two things that are driving it. One that's justified and one that's just a factor of the modern economy and news consumption. And the first is that news consumption. If you pick up any national paper, you turn on national cable news, you are likely to see a story, certainly this year, about major layoffs at tech firms. So here are all these huge employers in the United States that are reducing headcount by 10%, for example. What gets unreported in almost every one of those stories is that those same companies increase their headcount by 40 and 50% over the last 2 to 3 years. So with the exception of Twitter, every major tech company that we can find will still be employing multiple levels of hire new people today after the layoffs than they did before we went into the pandemic. So it's an environment in which people just greatly expanded hiring. So people are confused by the news that they're hearing that isn't accurately reflecting what's going on in the economy. The second, and I think more justified reason, is because in most of our adult lifetimes, we've never had inflation like this. So you got to go back to the early 1980s, where you see inflationary levels like this and price increases. And so a reflection of the poor state of the economy is an accurate reflection of the cost of inflation on our lives and in our businesses. And we don't know how to process that other than ascribing it to the fact that the economy is doing poorly. And of course, inflation does remain the biggest threat. So when we look at the economic outlook going forward, we still think that there's a 40 to 50% chance that we have a very small, shallow recession at the end of this year or the very beginning of next year. And that's driven because of the difficulty we see in driving inflation out of the economy right now. That the tough part is yet to come for the Federal Reserve. The easy part was getting inflation down to where it is today. The tough part is getting it down to between 2 and 3%. And so we think that additional rate hikes, maybe even more than what the market is already pricing in, are going to be necessary to wring inflation out of the system. Of course, the Fed, unfortunately, is not getting much help on the policy front. If you think about inflation as a supply and demand problem, so too much money chasing too few goods, the Federal Reserve can deal with the demand side, and it can use interest rates to reduce demand, but they really can't do much about the supply side. And that's where public policy comes into play and why we're focused on a public policy agenda that actually can help on the supply front. And we outlined this agenda at the beginning of this year, and we called it an agenda for American strength. And I want to talk about 4 particular pillars that we think will help reduce inflation and put us on a trajectory for long-term growth, and that we think we can actually make some progress on over the next several years. The first is plain and simple workforce. So I described the unemployment levels a moment ago. The other side of that coin is the number of open jobs. We have 11 million open jobs in this country, but only 5.7 million people looking for work. Even if everyone had the exact right, who was looking for work today, had the exact right skills and was located exactly where the job with the skills that they have is needed, even if we could match everyone perfectly, we still have about half as many jobs still going unfilled. We just don't have the people to fill them. Part of that is getting people who went onto the sidelines back into the workforce. If we could replicate the workforce participation rate that we had pre-pandemic today, we'd have 2.8 million more people in the workforce looking for work. But even that by itself won't get the job done. We are going to have to do something to right-size our legal immigration system at the same time that we secure our borders so that we can meet our workforce demands going forward. Our failure to do something about this means that we're going to keep inflation artificially high, but that we're also putting a cap on growth. When we talk to businesses, virtually regardless of size, sector, or part of the country, their biggest problem today is a lack of workers to meet demand. And if you look at the demographics of the nation, that isn't going to change precipitously in any meaningful way in the future without some effort to modernize our legal immigration system. So we're launching an effort that's calling on Congress to do 2 things this year. 1, take necessary steps to secure the border, and 2, combine that with efforts to modernize the legal immigration system. We got actually pretty close at the end of last year on a bipartisan agreement that was focused on ag workers. There were discussions around seasonal workers under the H-2B program. We think those are 2 prime candidates for making progress this year. So if immigration and border security is kind of the first pillar of our agenda, the second is permitting reform. This is all about efficiency in the economy. The prior Congress and the infrastructure bill and other legislation has put a lot of money into the pipeline to address our deteriorating infrastructure. Yet we can't put that money to work if we're still hung up in the red tape and the multi-year long processes of the current permitting system. Even worse, private capital is caught up in those same permitting log jams and can't be put to use. This is particularly true when it comes to energy and fossil fuels, but equally true when we look at clean and renewable energy, where we just can't build the infrastructure that there's capital to build because of delays caused by permitting. At the end of last year, we had 2 competing bills, one from Senate Democrats and one from Senate Republicans, to modernize our permitting system. To put that in context, it would be the first modernization since NEPA was created in the 1970s. So we're operating under a system that we really haven't touched since the 1970s. What was interesting when we looked at those 2 competing proposals, one from Republicans, one from Democrats, is despite their differences, there was a lot of areas of common agreement. And so for the last several months, we've been working to figure out how we bridge those differences and how we build a coalition to help get permitting reform across the finish line, to make it easier to construct everything from energy projects to highway and road infrastructure. The third issue that we're pushing on, we could use the collective help of all of the business community, is jumpstarting a trade agenda. Unfortunately, the current administration not only has failed in terms of a trade agenda, they're actively working not to pursue anything that opens markets to trade. We think that is a fundamental mistake, that trade supports manufacturing jobs and agricultural jobs across the United States. In South Dakota, there are 27,000 jobs that are directly linked to us selling things to the 95% of consumers who live outside of the United States. In South Dakota, it generates $2.4 billion in economic activity. But the problem is that we're standing still. It's been a decade since the United States last added a new free trade partner, and that only brought us up to 20 countries where we can easily sell our goods and agricultural products without fear of tariffs or regulatory restrictions. By way of comparison, in that same decade, the rest of the world inked 100 different trade deals. Our neighbor to the north, Canada, now has trade agreements with 51 different countries. We're just being outworked and outpaced. And that means that when it comes to selling our goods to growing populations in Asia and Africa, we're just frankly missing out. We're also missing out on the opportunity to form alliances, frankly, to compete with China. And so we're making a big push, and we're getting a lot of positive feedback from both Republicans and Democrats on the Hill who understand this, who understand the missed opportunities, and are helping us put pressure on the administration to restart a trade agenda. The easiest place to do that is the UK. There's no greater ally to the US than Great Britain. We don't have a trade agreement with them. They want one with us. That's an easy place for the administration and Congress to start. And there are opportunities in Africa where that is eager for deals with the United States rather than deals with China, and openings that we can pursue there. The fourth issue I'll mention, and it's one where we're really trying to prevent people from throwing a wet blanket on the economy, and that is regulatory overreach. One of the things that we see in this administration is an approach to a regulatory environment that really has no modern counterpart in my lifetime. You actually have to go back to kind of early 1970s, 1960s to see an approach to the economy like what we're seeing out of federal agencies right now. Many of you will remember that, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, we took a deregulatory approach to the U.S. economy. In the mid-1970s, if you got on an airplane, where that airplane flew and the cost of your seat on that plane was decided by the federal government. It was regulated as a platform. If you had something that you had to ship across this country and you put it on a train, the cost of shipping that on the train was set by the federal government because we regulated them as essentially public utilities. If you had to make a long-distance phone call, the cost of that long-distance phone call was determined by federal regulations because that's how we treated telecommunications. And in the 70s and 80s, we moved completely away from that. We adopted an approach of deregulation and letting the market work. And it worked. None of us pay for long-distance phone calls anymore because it's all included, in our phone plans. We have more carriers flying to more places with more lower price tickets adjusted for inflation than we had in the 1970s. And so deregulation worked. Unfortunately, we have a Federal Trade Commission, an EPA, a Consumer Credit Bureau agency that rejects all of that and wants to return to a pre-1970s approach of treating finance and transportation and telecommunications essentially as public utilities, where the services that are provided are regulated by government and the prices are regulated by government as well. That is the surest way we know of at the U.S. Chamber to kill innovation and to weaken and dampen our economy. And so we're pushing back strongly at the FTC. We're in litigation there over some of their attempts to regulate the size of companies. We're in litigation with the SEC over some of their attempts to use financial disclosures to backdoor in public policy changes related to climate and other issues. We're in litigation with the CFPB over their attempts to regulate how banks provide credit to consumers and to businesses, all because we think each of these regulatory efforts is an attempt to return us to that kind of government knows best approach that would be disastrous for our economy. So I mentioned those things because these are all in addition to the normal regulatory fights that we have, where we're fighting over permitting for fossil fuels, or as we did yesterday, suing the EPA over their waters of the United States attempt to regulate ponds in your backyard as navigable waterways of the United States. Those are things that we've been arguing over for decades. All of the things that I just mentioned to you about regulating the platforms of the economy is brand new and presents an important challenge, we think, to the business community. And that's one of the reasons it's a key part of our agenda. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take questions about the economy, about the legislative agenda that we have at the U.S. Chamber, or frankly, anything else that you might want to talk about.
Neil, this is David Owen. Neil, this is David Owen, South Dakota Chamber. I'll start with one, and then we'll pass the microphone around. We got a blizzard. Our business day is good at causing blizzards, so we have a fairly small crowd, but they're all influential policymakers and people that can get in trouble for asking the wrong question. Trump administration put on a bunch of tariffs. U.S. Chamber was a little crabby about that. I see Biden has, I think, continued most of them. Would you talk about you mentioned free trade agreements. Would you talk about those tariffs and how many are still around and what the U.S. Chamber thinks about them?
Yeah, thanks, David. And by the way, if you all were here, it is 80 degrees and sunny in Washington, D.C. today. The biggest challenge that we have is things are already starting to bloom. And if you're like me and you have allergies, it's already beginning to wreak havoc with my system. So I don't know if I want blizzard, but it is way too early for 80-degree weather and the trees to be in bloom. You're right. We very much oppose the tariffs that were put in place by the Trump administration. Tariffs are taxes on U.S. customers and U.S. businesses. So despite what people said, companies in foreign countries do not pay that tax. The folks who import those goods. So whether it's you, the consumer, buying it, or a manufacturer using it for inputs, we pay those taxes. And interestingly, by the way, many of them invited retaliatory tariffs, which then hurt our exports into other countries. There were really two sections of tariffs that the previous administration put in. One was around aluminum and steel and some of those kind of inputs. The Trump administration itself had walked some of those back in negotiating some quota deals. The Biden administration has continued that. So some of those have gone away. The other tranche was tariffs on goods coming out of China. And those the Biden administration has left in place. Now, we'll be the first to say, while we don't like tariffs and we think tariffs are taxes, China is also an unfair competitor. And they use their government to subsidize their companies. They steal our intellectual property. And in some instances, you may have a tariff that can be linked to some of that malfeasance on the part of China, and then it might make sense to maintain that tariff. So what we've suggested is let's have a discussion about the areas of strategic import to the United States where we are being disadvantaged. But it's really hard to extend that to every good that comes in from China. So, a baseball hat or a plastic swimming pool or those things do not constitute national security threats to the United States. They're not especially imbued with intellectual property that's being stolen that constitutes an economic threat to the United States. And in those instances, those tariffs don't make as much sense. They're just taxes imposed on Americans. And we should bifurcate the things that are really important where tariffs might be justified and get rid of the tariffs that don't serve a national security or economic security interest and instead just raise costs.
Thank you. Questions? I'm going to play pass the mic.
Thank you. Hi there. My name's Mike Bockerny. I would like to circle back to your comments on needing to fix our borders and fix our immigration policy. What's actually the chances of that actually occurring for real?
Mike, it's a great question. I will tell you, when I mention it around this town in Washington, I get a lot of eye rolls and skepticism that there is a lot of doubt that has built up that we can ever do anything about either of those problems. And I'm not going to suggest that that doubt doesn't have some good foundations, but I want to suggest two things in response. One is that privately there's more progress than has been made than most people want to admit. And second, absent a push from the business community, absent a push demanding some action both on border security and immigration, we are never going to get these things fixed. And that is the only unacceptable outcome. So on the first point, when you look at ag workers, they got a bipartisan vote in the U.S. House of Representatives, that if we'd have had another month in the last Congress, we probably could have gotten a bipartisan deal in the Senate. And that combined mandatory E-Verify with an increase in the number of people here who work in agriculture and a reform of the ag permitting process. I think that's very doable. If you look at Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina, Republican, Kristen Sinema, Democrat from Arizona, who had a proposal and a working group from both parties of a sufficient number of senators that I think we could have gotten it across the finish line, combining border security with something for dreamers. You can see how you could put the votes together to get something like that done. We were in discussions at the House in late December about essentially writing some new rules for H-2B visas that would dramatically increase the cap. And we were at the table with the AFL-CIO, and it came down to a couple of issues that prevented us from getting a deal, but they're not, in my opinion, kind of insurmountable this year. So that's a long way of saying that I agree. The sense is that this is even harder than entitlement reform. This is even harder than reforming Social Security and Medicare. But we see green shoots. And as I've said here publicly, I don't think any member of Congress wants to face the electorate in 2024 and say, well, I had some great speeches about border security. I had some great speeches about the workforce, but I didn't get anything done. And I think if we paint that kind of contrast, I think we can get something done.
Yes, Derek, thank you for your comments and for those four pillars of the Chamber of Commerce. We appreciate that. I'm a community banker in eastern South Dakota. One comment I'd like to make about the unique situation where people feel their own businesses are doing good, but the overall economy isn't. When I talk to our customers, the best way I could explain that is parents the day after Halloween. They know the kids are feeling great, but they also recognize it's simply a sugar high and it's going away. As a community banker, I saw our small bank in eastern South Dakota during the 2000-2001 grow from $2 billion to $3 billion, simply due to all the supplemental payments coming out, the PPP loans, the grants, and so forth. And most of our businesses recognize that's going to go away. So I think that might be the reason, anyway, in our part of the country, that's what they're seeing right now, that's starting to go away. We also saw our delinquencies go to almost nothing. We have a nationwide credit card operation. Our delinquencies went almost to nothing. They're starting to very quickly trend back to normal, what I would call normal levels now, because again, that sugar high is going to weigh off. We printed $7 trillion. It had to make people happy in one way.
Listen, I think that's right. And I like your analogy. I think and I will say, if we were having this conversation 9 months ago, I probably would have said the exact same. This is a sugar high, and it's not that we're going to fall back to normal. It's that we're going to crash, and that the crash after the sugar high is going to be really, really terrible. What's changed our view a little bit in that is that the strength of the jobs market and the ability of employers to increase wages, not all the way keeping with inflation, but enough that you can support consumer demand without a fall off. And so when we look at the demographics of the labor force and the ability of workers to be able to consume, we continue to see this tight labor market that will allow for some normalization there to support, I hate to use the Fed's term of a softer landing, but to attain something that avoids a crash and looks like what I think you're describing with credit card delinquencies, and that is a return to more normal trend lines on the economy. And if we think about more normal trend lines pre-pandemic, so go back to 2019, for example, it was a remarkably good economy. So if we can get back to the trend line of 2019, and I think there is a pathway to get there, that's a reason I feel optimistic.
Thank you. I've asked if there's any other questions. I sense there isn't, so I'll do an exit question. I've enjoyed the Zoom era for getting to see people's offices and homes. You look like you have a couple of interesting documents on the wall as a way of saying goodbye. Would you explain what those are?
Sure. So I spent almost 20 years on Capitol Hill, the last 11 in the House Republican leadership. And I didn't get to work on the fun bills. I had to work on the ones that no one else wanted to deal with. So one of those is the reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank after a huge inter-party squabble that prevented us from extending the Ex-Im Bank, which supports American exporters, particularly small business exporters. The other one, interestingly, is quite timely. If you've been following the conversation about the debt limit this year, the last time we had a big fight over the debt limit in Washington was 2011, and it resulted in the Budget Control Act. And so that one is the Budget Control Act that I helped negotiate with then President Obama's team to avoid a default, and I will say reduce the federal deficit by 1.3 trillion over 10 years. So it wasn't a popular bill, but it had some positive outcomes.
Congratulations. That makes you a hero in our minds. So buy yourself a cape and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you, and be safe out there, and anything we can do to be helpful, please don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you.